Okay, 2:30 here in the UK, so I'm going to get started and welcome to everybody for joining us for this webinar to look at the launch of an Ipsos survey looking at climate education and children coming through secondary school receiving climate education. I'm going to make a brief introduction to the panel and then we'll look at the highlights from this report before we go into the panel discussion. And we're happy to take questions from you joining us on this event. If you can please put them in the chat at the bottom, I'll try and get through as many questions as I can. And we're hoping to wrap up just around 3:20 UK time. So introduction-wise, so I'm Professor Liz Bentley. I'm Chief Executive at the Royal Meteorological Society and delighted that this report has been published today in conjunction with Ipsos UK. On the call as well, I've also got Professor Andrew Charlton-Perez, who's Head of School of Mathematical, Physical and Computational Sciences at the University of Reading and a Professor of Meteorology. I've also got Dr. Sylvia Knight, who is Head of Education at the Royal Meteorological Society, working alongside myself. I've got Dr. Pippa Bailey, who is Head of Climate Change and Sustainability Practice at Ipsos UK, and will be presenting the findings of this survey in a minute. I've got Carl Ward, who is Chief Executive of City Learning Trust and Chair of the Foundation of Education Development. And I'm delighted I've got Eleanor May, who is a climate activist who's part of Teach the Future, and I think brings the average age of this panel down quite a bit. So thanks for joining us, Eleanor. So I'm going to quickly hand over to Pippa, who is going to share her screen and take us through some of the results of this Ipsos survey.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Liz. So I'm just going to take you through the results of this survey, and just to kind of set the scene, these are the findings of research which was conducted on Ipsos's Young Persons Omnibus survey. The research was conducted between 14th of March and the 1st of July this year, and they represent a sample of 271 pupils in their final academic year, so aged 15 to 16 years old, across England, Scotland and Wales. The aim of this research was to understand the level of climate literacy, so understanding of the Earth's climate and the impact of global warming amongst those leaving secondary school education. The questions asked in this survey were developed by the Royal Meteorological Society in conjunction with many of their members, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report authors, to make sure that they give a fair assessment on climate literacy and will remain relevant in years to come. This was an online-based self-completion survey which was conducted with pupils in their classes and administered by school staff. So that just provides some of the background about how the research was conducted. So I'm going to just take you through each of the questions and the insights that we had. So the first question they were asked is, how old were you when you were last taught about climate change in a lesson in school? And what you can see here is that 54% said that they've been taught about climate change in the last year, so during their final year at school when they were 15 or 16 years old. We have 17% who say that they can't remember, and then 11% who said 14 years, and then a fewer percentage sort of going back to the early stages of their secondary education. So just over 50% who say that they were taught about climate change in the last year. Our second question was asking about how much the climate has warmed since 1850, and this was provided some context. And what you can see here is that the mean answer was 2.5 degrees. We also, interestingly, asked this question in a global study, and we looked at UK adults who'd been asked the same question there. Mean result was slightly more accurate at 1.9 degrees centigrade. But what we see is that it tends to be overestimated, as you can see in this data here, and that only 7% of students gave that value between 1 and 1.2 degrees, which we would consider was a fairly accurate guess of the actual true value of 1.1 degrees, which gets talked about. So given that this is interesting because the 1.5 degrees seems to be mentioned a lot in the media and in conversations, so I think this is a really interesting insight that actually perhaps that message is not as clear to these school leavers as we perhaps might think it is. And then we were asking about how much, if at all, do you think the following have contributed to global warming? So we grouped together and we used the IPCC's reference here to compare their perceptions versus the actual rank. So you can see that the most selected answer was transport, cars, lorries, planes, trains and ships with 23%. But what's quite interesting is there is a poor correlation between their perceptions and the actual rank. And although slightly different, we do see this with adults in terms of what they perceive contributes to their own carbon footprint. So we are seeing even here at a macro level, when we're talking about different industries, that there's not good understanding about which sectors are contributing most to climate change. So definitely a knowledge gap with regard to this. And then we asked about how concerned these school leavers were about climate change. And you can see almost two thirds are saying they're either very or fairly concerned about climate change. So this is the majority. So there is concern. People do acknowledge that it's real. And we also then split this by looking at children doing well at school or not doing well at school. And this was self-defined. So they were asked a question about whether they perceived that they were performing well. So rather than this be categorized by the teacher, this was categorized by the individual. And what you can see is that there's greater level of concern amongst those who perceive that they're doing well at school, 74%, so almost 3/4 of those pupils that are concerned, compared to just over half of those not doing so well at school. And then finally, we asked, in your lifetime, to what extent do you think climate change is going to impact you personally? So personally in your lives. And we see that nearly 60% say that it's going to affect them either a great deal or quite a bit. So there's an acknowledgement that it's going to directly impact their lives, what they do, their ability to kind of conduct their lives. So an acknowledgement there very clearly. Very few saying that they don't think it's going to impact them at all. But we do have 1 in 10 saying, you know, I really don't know. I don't understand whether it's going to impact me or not, or believe whether it's going to impact me or not. So just summarising, most pupils say they have been taught about climate change in lessons during their school years, but only just over 50% in the last year. Despite this, there seems to be quite a gap in terms of understanding, about how much the planet has warmed since pre-industrial times, and also the cause of that, or the biggest sector cause of that climate change. And there is quite a high level of concern about climate change, and the fact that these individuals acknowledge that it's going to affect their lives as they move forward. So thank you. That's a short summary of the results.
Great, thank you very much, Pippa. If I could ask you to stop sharing your screen. We may come back to look at some of the slides if there's any specific questions, but I have got a question actually I'd like to address quite quickly, which you may be able to answer, Pippa. So this has come from Alex Brown asking, how many schools did the young people taking part in this survey, how many schools did they represent? Do you have a feel for that? I know we have a number of students that participated, but do you have a feel for the range of schools that were represented?
So we approached, 60 schools took part in the study overall, just over 2,500 students, but we survey in different years because the Young Person's Omnibus addresses more. We had more questions that were included in this. So we were specifically interested in this quite narrow gap of 15 to 16-year-olds. So of those 16 schools, 18 took part across Wales, Scotland and England in the survey, year 11 pupils, so 18 schools. Right. I should note that we were impacted, as everyone will be aware, by COVID. We had Omicron at the beginning of the year, which affected schools' ability, well, pupils and teachers to be in school. So, but yes, 18 schools, so we were able to get a good spread.
Great. And obviously we're going to do this on an annual basis going forward. So having just said what you've just said, do you anticipate that the number of schools and pupils that will participate in future years will go up?
Absolutely, yeah. We would expect to be able to get more schools, and we were also talking about including Northern Ireland as well in the next wave. which we're discussing. So definitely we would expect that number to be higher. We had to work quite hard just because a lot of schools weren't in, or in order to get that number, but definitely we would, at the outset, we would have expected to get more completes and cover more schools.
Great, thank you. So I think that answers Mike's question, sorry. There's another one about the balance of state schools and public schools. Do you have a feel for that in the schools that were participated in the survey?
Yeah, so there were no fee-paying schools that were included in the survey.
Okay, thank you. Great, thanks, Pippa. Okay, so I'm just going to now pose a few questions really to the panel, and happy to then take more questions from those in the audience as we go. So can I go around the panel, really just starting with, I guess, a discussion about the results themselves, what stood out for you in those results of the survey, and is it representative from your own experience? So I'm going to start with Andrew, if I can.
Thanks, Liz. I find the whole thing really, really fascinating and kind of sobering. I think the result that really stands out to me is the literacy question, essentially, on how much the Earth has warmed. Now, you might argue that's a fairly esoteric number, and it's perhaps not entirely relevant to people who are not deeply engaged in climate science or policy. But I think because so much of climate policy is framed around that target, and the choices that we make are framed around 1.5 and 2 degrees, it's really sobering to see that both that many respondents don't know the amount of warming, and also that people do tend to overestimate, and also that overestimation is greater for young people than it is for the adult population. So that's what really stood out for me.
Thanks, Andrew. And from your own experience, is that what you found when you've engaged with schools as well yourself over the years?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think particularly the result on don't know. I think a lot of people will say that, and sometimes that's a confidence issue. But I think other times it reflects the type of education they've had on climate change, whether they've had a more quantitative education or it's where that climate change education has appeared, I suppose.
Great, thank you, Andrew. So Sylvia, I guess what stands out for you, and does the survey itself represent your own experiences as well?
I think similarly, the one standout message from it was just how much the 1.5 and 2 degree messages have failed, where we might perceive that they have been used a lot, and that message just hasn't reached that generation. So that's one message. The other thing I think is probably more positive, which is that over half of students were reporting that they'd learned about climate change in the last year, and I think that's quite hopeful when you tend to hear from young people that they're saying that they haven't learned. If you ask any individual, or if I have conversations with people in that age category, frequently they'll say, "Oh no, we haven't done anything about climate change." So I thought that was quite positive.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sylvia. Carl, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think this is an important survey, particularly if it's going to be done on an annual basis from that point of view. And I'd like to see next time it's done, those numbers really ramped up. I think it's a good representative survey, but I think the numbers, the educational community can really plug numbers in there to make it significantly large. Interestingly enough, if you were to ask me to postulate, would those things change the numbers? Probably not. But it's better to have a much larger sample, especially when you're taking to government an argument about something. I would think that this is aimed at Year 11 students, and I would think the vast majority of students that have said that they've been taught about climate science in the last year have probably been done through science, because most of those students will have undertaken science in the final year of some sort, whether it be a single, double or triple option from that perspective. And that would have been taught in that vein, I'm pretty sure about that. So it'd be quite interesting to see perhaps a question in there in the future about spread of subjects from that perspective, because I suspect it's just science there. And I think these two other things that come to mind as well. Probably perhaps difficult to get into to a survey, but it'd be useful. What percentage of disadvantaged students against advantaged students answer the same? That would be an interesting aspect from that point of view, because, you know, that could dictate conversations moving forward. But I think this is a good start. It poses lots of questions that need to be drilled down a little bit more from that point of view. I also think that that we could probably need to look at what the differentiation is between England, Wales, Scotland, and if Northern Ireland's going to be plugged in, because they're 4 separate education jurisdictions that don't really correlate curriculums. So looking to differentiate those 4 areas of jurisdiction in the future might be quite useful. It may not change the result, it could change it dramatically. Yeah.
Thanks, Carl. And Pippa, I guess, is there any way we could do that with this survey? Is there any way of knowing where the school is, the student is based demographically?
Yeah, we can certainly do that. We have a lot of detailed information about the schools, and so if we have big base sizes, we can do more subgroup analysis. We did delve into the data, but and kind of saw some trends in things, but nothing that we would want to say was statistically significant based on the sample size we had and the regions that we had. But yes, we could definitely look to increase that base size to be able to make that comparison between those the 4 major regions, to start to understand, you know, where the differences are.
Great, thanks, Pippa. So Eleanor, I'm really interested in your view on this. So again, when you looked at the survey, what were the key messages that stood out for you, and how does it resonate, I guess, with your own experiences and those of your kind of peers around you?
It absolutely lines up with, so I left school 2 years ago almost, and it completely lines up with my experience of school, and it also lines up with the research that Teach the Future's commissioned in the last few years. Especially that this found that over 60% of students are concerned, and we have a stat from a couple of years ago saying 68% of students want to learn more, and it really shows that there is that desire from students to learn, and that perhaps if they did know more, you know, it would help to combat that eco-anxiety. And I think something that really stood out to me was the 1 in 6 can't remember when they were taught about it, because what Teach the Future is fighting for is for climate education to be embedded across the curriculum and link up to the intersectionality of it, because it impacts all parts of lives and not just science and geography. And so it really goes to show that it's currently being taught as a tick box activity just because it might be a page in an exam and not because it might affect their lives. And so I just want to plug that Teach the Future have just in the last few days released their tracked changes. So if you want to find out more about how we think it can be embedded across the curriculum, we have hundreds of pages of reports that have been put together.
Great. And Ellen, if you want to put some links to those reports in the chat or in the Q&A, please feel free to do so. Pippa, I'd really be interested. I mean, you obviously are involved in many surveys around, you know, climate change and sustainability. What's the importance of this one from your perspective, and were there any surprises that came out in the survey?
Yeah, I mean, we get asked a lot about generations, and we're doing a lot of work. There'll be a report later this year, generally looking at generations from Ipsos, but particularly when it comes to sustainability. And you know, this is not conclusive, but we do see some polarization between kind of, yes, very much activists. So like Eleanor, who are, you know, doing a great job of raising the importance of this as an issue. It's affecting, you know, the up and coming generation more. And it's something that we obviously need to address as quickly as we can. But we also see some, yeah, as we say, eco-anxiety, but also some fatalism creeping in, perhaps more in the younger, because some people are saying, you know, it already feels like it's too late. And it's really important that we also, I think, promote, you know, the positivity and the hope. And it was interesting when we were looking at whose responsibility is and who they think are acting in another survey is younger generations were saying putting more trust in kind of NGOs in order to be able to do the right thing and science. So that's kind of interesting. We're definitely seeing some bits joining up, and I think we're going to get a better understanding, because with generations, it's really important that we look at the generation effect, not because someone's young or that it's a period effect that, you know, that we've been in COVID. So lots of things will have affected everybody irrespective of generation. We need to truly understand the generational effect, what's different about the Zoomers, as they often get called, that makes them distinct. And so we need to have more longitudinal data to understand that, and something that we're focusing on a lot, and will be important for us to understand moving forward.
Great, thank you. So I guess a question for the panel, but also for those listening in as well. I guess we've looked at the questions we asked this time, and we've seen the results of the survey. But you know, are there opportunities to make some changes, some tweaks that would actually provide some really valuable information? And I know, Carl, you mentioned about maybe a question around which subjects did they actually learn about climate change. That might help as well. So can I go around the panel, and for anybody who's listening into this, if there are questions or tweaks to the questions that we have in the current survey that might just unleash a little bit more important information, please do feel free to put that in the Q&A or the chat. So I'm going to start with, so I'll come to you again, Carl. I know you've already suggested including subjects where climate change was taught. Are there any other thoughts that you might have about tweaking or additional questions we might add in future surveys?
I think an idea of where mainly students think that their subject is being taught, definitely. I think we've also got to bear in mind that my experience of children being asked questions in school is a bit haphazard. You know, if we asked certain students whether they'd been taught maths in school, I would imagine about 90% of them would say yes and 10% would say no. So there's always going to be an area of, you know, it's the way children are, even when you're in year 11. I think what's also important is, and I did mention it before, some way of trying to differentiate whether disadvantaged children have the same sort of knowledge. And I think the survey does start to indicate that as perhaps more advantaged children in this space. That advantage gap often causes lots of problems in understanding, and I would imagine it will be mirrored here. But it will be interesting to see if we could set a question up to try and differentiate and understand that area.
Great, thanks, Carl. Sylvia, any thoughts?
Well, I'll start by saying that the 5 questions that we did ask were, as Andrew, who contributed to them, it was not easy to come up with those 5 questions because we wanted them to be questions that we could use year on year, and so weren't going to become more or less relevant in future years, or so it wasn't easy. But we do have a lot of other questions that we'd like to ask, and so it's just picking the main ones. I should probably say about the concerned one, so how concerned people were about climate change. We asked that one because it presupposes that people are aware of climate change. So it was giving us a little bit of extra information, really, because you're not going to be concerned about it unless you're aware that it's happening. So that was why that question was there.
Okay, thanks, Sylvia. Eleanor, any thoughts?
I think it's a difficult one to, as Sylvia was saying, to decide what questions get asked because it's such a changing topic. I mean, IPCC release new reports each year. And so I think the questions that were posed were good, but it would be interesting to see if there's other questions, perhaps relating to COP over the last year, that could be asked in the future and maybe rotated around just to get a strong view of exactly how it does affect students and how their perception changes of it.
Great, thank you. And Andrew?
I have a couple, one of which I think is a little easier to formulate a question and one which is maybe impossible to formulate a question. So I think that it's really interesting to know that, you know, I think it's something like 60% feel that climate change will affect them. I think it's interesting to dig into that further, so to understand in what aspects of their life do they think will be affected by that. And I think that's really interesting because it guides changes to education about how to make this material relevant. I think it's always interesting to understand the relationship between information and action. I think those are really hard questions to formulate, and so that's why I say it's quite difficult to think about how you would phrase that. Pippa probably has all sorts of thoughts about that, but I think ultimately there is a purpose in understanding how people are taught and what people are taught, because we want to ultimately turn that into changes of behaviour and those kinds of things. So yeah.
And Pippa, I guess any thoughts from you around, I guess, tweaking or additional questions, but also the importance, I guess, of not changing things too much. The whole point of this is that we want to see a trend change over time. And if you keep changing the questions every year, then you start to it's hard to, you're comparing apples and pears kind of thing. So yeah, any thoughts on how we might just improve this survey, but the importance of not changing it too much?
Yeah, absolutely. With any tracking survey, and that's the hardest thing, as Sylvia said, about crafting the questions, is making them future-proof, because later on, we have to be very careful with language, because language, particularly in this area, changes continuously. And I think the public are bamboozled with lots of language and what it means, and carbon neutral, net zero, climate change, etc., and what this means to people. So trying to make sure we're very careful with the wording, which we were in designing these questions, to try and make them future-proofed. But I think something that we see with the sector question, which is interesting, I think having a much bigger base size will give us more power to do that subgroup analysis, which will be important, because then it means more specific focus can be given to the areas needed most. So that's going to be important. So more about sample than questions. But something we do see, and this is globally with adults, which I think also applies to children, is citizens are often criticised for what we call the say-do gap. Like, you care, you're worried about the environment, but you're not doing anything. And we actually call this the believe true gap, because the data would suggest that people don't understand the impact of their behaviours and choices always. And so this need for education is accentuated even further, particularly with adults, because some people feel totally powerless. They're like, I have to buy the products that are available. I don't have a choice to buy products without packaging, or it's very difficult. And so trying to educate adults. So I think this believe true gap, we use a very similar question to the one that we used with the sectors, but more kind of granular. So what do you think is going to have a big, walking more, taking public transport, moving to a lower meat and dairy diet, etc., small changes, may be interesting, because then that will also tell us. But I think the sector question is interesting, because that is macro, so it works well over time, and these things may change, as the energy sources hopefully become much more sustainable. That balance may start to change in terms of agriculture as well. That may start to change, and in the long term. So yeah, but I think getting a bigger sample is the key focus, and keeping the consistency. But if it would be digging in a bit deeper about that believe true gap, so that misunderstanding about their own individual actions.
Great, thank you. So there's a few comments and questions in the Q&A relating to particularly the temperature question that we had around, how much has the global average temperatures warmed. And again, an understanding of what average temperatures are, and when we look at when we talk about 1.5 or 1.1 degree of warming, these are temperature anomalies. They're not kind of real temperatures that we measure outside day to day. And so you have to almost be, I think there's comments in here about, mathematically literate. You have to understand what these things are to have a view on, where these numbers. So there may be an issue in here about, to us as scientists, that seems a fairly straightforward question, but to a member of the general public and students, it actually is a more complicated question. They don't really understand the context of it. So we may want to think about that. And I don't know if any of the panel have any thoughts or comments on that initially. Andrew, you've got your hand up.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right, Liz. I think in a sense, though, the counter to that is that is the framing which is discussed in newspapers, on websites, by government in policy. And so a goal of our climate education has to be that people understand that, whether they're particularly numerate or not. I think that's really important. So
great. Eleanor?
I completely agree that it's something that's come up in Teach the Future's collaborations with exam boards when we've been talking about what we want from like the new natural history GCSE, is that so much about numeracy and maths literacy, especially around data, is something that is so frequently hated among students when it pops up in other subjects. It was always in geography, the ones where you have to interpret a graph were always the most hated ones. And we really need to think about how we frame data literacy in schools, because with the rise of misinformation, there's just this poor understanding of the way that people communicate data, and it leaves a lot of the general public left behind, especially young people who are perhaps going to be exposed to more misinformation or poorly presented data. And I think it's something that needs to pop up more and more in other subjects, as much as kids hate seeing it, because data it's like the climate, it comes into all subjects and it can be used wrongly so quickly and easily.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, there's a comment in the Q&A about supporting teachers to help explain this to children. So there's an educational role here that we can, communicate what we mean when we talk about 1.1 degree of global average warming. There's a question here from Ed, which Pippa, I'd be just interested, you mentioned it, I think, in one of your slides, but an interesting comparison to look at between how much young people feel better informed than maybe the general public. And I know the question around this number of, how much has the global average temperature warmed, you could compare with other surveys that have been done with a wider kind of general public. Is there anything from this survey that would suggest that the younger generation coming out of schools are better educated than the general public? Can we compare any surveys that you've done elsewhere to this particular one to draw any conclusions?
Yeah, I mean, that was a question that we purposely asked. So we run a lot of kind of surveys across 28 markets or just in the UK. And we actually took the RMETS question and included that in a global survey to make that a comparison. I thought so it would suggest from that adults understand that 1.5 degree better than this school leavers group. So that's kind of interesting. And is that because it's more in the media that they're looking at? I don't know. That's just our hypothesis, but it does suggest that this kind of believe true gap exists for both for adults and for children. So it's something that we hope that gap will close.
Yeah, great. So a suggestion here about maybe asking in the survey about their understanding of how they can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So not just how much of an understanding have they got around climate science and climate change, but are they empowered, I guess, to make decisions on how they can make some change as well? Is that may be useful to think about? And I don't know whether, again, Pippa, whether we do that in other surveys about whether are people aware of the actions that they can take. I have seen some surveys from Ipsos, I think, where some people overestimate some changes that don't have a big impact and underestimate ones that do have big impacts. I think I've seen a survey on that.
Recycling tends to be the top answer, like 60%, and then the next answer is 30-something%. And that's because I think recycling is something they feel empowered to do, and it impacts them every day. They can see the packaging, and there's a guilt associated with, not for everybody, but for many people, with regard to throwing a lot of rubbish in the bin. And councils are moving towards it's sometimes complex, but providing the facilities in order for people to be able to recycle better, and some local initiatives as well. So I think because they feel empowered to do it, and it's something that they're doing, they're hoping, perhaps feeling that it has a bigger impact than it does, than perhaps using public transport or changing their diets or doing one less long haul flight a year, or holidaying local, getting involved in other things which are perhaps more difficult to do. And we know that there are different segments we're not an amorphous mass. There are some people who are much more putting themselves out and willing to pay more, but also likewise at the other end of the scale, some people who are just denying that it's still a thing. Less, of course, and I think we can't avoid the kind of climate related news across the globe, and that's definitely reducing that figure.
Yeah. So I guess when we think about tweaking questions or adding new questions, I guess what is the purpose of this survey? Why are we doing this? What do we want to achieve? What's this evidence going to be used to be taken forward? And I'd like to just hear from the panel about the importance of doing these surveys and I guess what the next steps are with the results of this survey. I'll start with Sylvia because I think obviously the driving force really behind the survey and the initiative itself.
Partly the driving force from the survey was really just to get some evidence for the climate literacy of school leavers, because we've been hearing so much about it. But at the Society and with all the people that we collaborate with, we're looking at how we can better support teachers to deliver climate change, teaching across all subjects. And that's very much something that we're looking to increase a lot in the future. So like Teach the Future, we've done our own audit of the current GCSE specifications across all subjects. And even without tweaking those specifications, there are lots of opportunities for climate education that just aren't being made best use of at the moment. So the question is how we can support teachers and how we can make it, without increasing their workload, how we can just increase the quality and the quantity of climate change education that our students are getting.
Great, thank you. Carl, any thoughts?
Well, I was just reminded, listening to the conversations in the last 10 minutes, of about 13 or 14 years ago, I was teaching in a school, and I used a climate change film. Some of you may remember Al Gore, previous American deputy vice president, I should say, did a film on climate change. And I showed it to a class of particularly disadvantaged students who were absolutely gripped in the first 10 minutes. After that, they couldn't access anything at all, but they were gripped in the first 10 minutes because it showed the impact of climate change on all our futures. And I think there's a lesson there. We were talking a few minutes ago about interpretation of maths data. And I can tell you now, interpretation of maths data between subjects in secondary schools and primary schools is a constant bugbear, i.e. understanding how to interpret maths data in different subjects and teach it right, i.e. mathematically accurately. It's a constant difficulty to get right for a school in any type of maths from that point of view. But for me, whether it's 1%, 2.5, 20, 30%, or whatever it is, I mean, in reality, you've got to remember there are about 40% of students leave secondary school below the national average in terms of attainment in maths. They're not necessarily, that's 40% that go into the general public, one might say, every year that don't have that acute maths knowledge to understand the impact of this. But they will understand the imagery and the impact of not doing nothing and how that will change. And I think there's a really important message there for how we get students gripped by the impact of climate change. We can talk numbers, but if we show what those numbers are going to do to our futures, it will have a much greater impact.
Great, no, absolutely. And Carl, while I've still got you, the power of surveys like this, having the evidence, having the numbers, and as we said earlier, I think greater numbers completing the survey as we go forward in future years will help. What can we do with a survey like this?
Well, I think once the numbers are scaled up, these are useful numbers now. When we try and influence the education department in terms of numbers for surveys, we're usually looking at about 2,000, 3,000 respondents to surveys that tend to then be able to be extrapolated. So getting to that number will be really good. And then over time, and not too much because we haven't got a lot of time in this, let's face it, it's good to have a survey that you can track back over time, but we haven't got an awful lot of time in making the impact on this and doing the changes that we need. It's ticking away all the time, literally. So I think the need to want to then use good arguments here to say, not enough students that have left in this survey know what they need to know about climate change at this stage, and what do we need to do to change that. Even if there's a margin of error of 10%, there's still, for let's say 30% of students that don't, that's a third, that's too many. So I think it's important that we do use this to say we do need to make that change in how schools are able to access good quality learning in this area in a fairly regimented manner, i.e. that schools know they can go somewhere, and as you know, the Fed's working on a piece of work with a lot of partners with that at the moment, and leaders in schools can from a very soon moment in time say, well, if I want to know where this is being taught in my curriculum currently and accurately, at whatever level I am, I can go to this document, I can find it, and I can implement it in my school. Because I don't think schools don't want to get involved with this. It's just that when you're running a really busy school and you've got lots of competing pressures, you just don't know where to go to find the solution. And we need to make that easy for schools.
Great. Heard that loud and clear. Thank you, Carl. So Pippa, I guess I'd just like your view on, surveys like this, the power of them to make change. And, have you got examples where, there've been some really powerful Ipsos surveys that have actually, I don't know, leveraged some funding to make a change, or actually a policy introduction because of the survey results?
Yeah, I mean, because we work across both the public and private sector, I think that's where the kind of sweet spot is with regard to understanding the policy. And obviously we have teams who are doing a lot of the policy evaluation, and then the citizen understanding. So the ability to kind of bring those two things together. I can't share examples from the private sector just from confidentiality, but yes, definitely is how better to drive behaviour change. Behaviour change is a massive thing. It's not just about nudges, it's truly understanding about the dynamics that underpin or prevent the barriers for people shifting behaviour, education being part of it, having the knowledge, but also physical ability, access, many other factors. So using kind of behavioural science frameworks is really useful for breaking down, the policy is trying to achieve this. How can we break that down to understand why it's working or how it could work better? So definitely bringing that citizen insight and understanding people. Also, ethnography is a very old type of research, but sometimes being with people, seeing what their lives are actually like, are the light bulb moments of this is why this isn't working, this is why, this is how we need to do things differently. There are some really good commercial examples of misunderstanding or making too many assumptions about, so even climate literacy in schools, unless you're a teacher, unless you're a child at that school experiencing that, how can it best be delivered so that it has the greatest impact afterwards? So I think, it may be even interesting if there are different approaches being applied in the different regions of the UK, then we can start to understand, actually, this seems to be more effective in communicating these things. Or so I think, as time goes on, it'll be interesting to understand that. But yes, definitely, that is the sweet spot, the citizen understanding the policy and evaluating the policy together, and using behavioural science can be incredibly powerful.
Thanks, Pippa. Eleanor, I'd like your views on this. So, it's a survey, it's got some really powerful information in there. There'll be lots of talk about it, but, it's about turning this into action, isn't it, really? And I guess from your perspective, what would you like to see coming from this survey? Where would you like us to kind of take this evidence and make some kind of change, see some activities, see some action to see some physical change?
So I think this kind of data can be really impactful when you're actually asking for curriculum change. And so the research that Teach the Future has commissioned has been taken quite directly through our contacts with Department for Education, because we've met a number of times over the last couple of years, part of that through the Youth Advisory Board in the draft period of their climate and sustainability strategy. And so we were able to take the statistics we found to back up why we believed they needed more. And although the plan itself, the strategy itself, we were disappointed with the final result, it meant that we could then counter it and announce why we didn't think it was enough to keep that momentum going. Because if you're just shouting at the government for a bit with no actual information behind you, you're a lot easier to ignore. But in terms of what else we can do with the information, I think Teach the Future would be particularly interested in seeing a breakdown between, as some of you were mentioning earlier, asking about what actions people are taking or how they value different actions. And Teach the Future could be interested in having a breakdown between what actions people take and how concerned they are about climate change, because what we're trying to do is change the curriculum in a way that firstly educates about what's actually happening in terms of climate change and how it's affecting people, but also about how people can act and what needs to happen to help combat it. And so we find that people who currently experience eco-anxiety are often people who know a bit more about climate change, but feel that no one else around them does, and so they feel that they're alone. Whereas when they start to take action, they build communities around it. And so it would be really interesting to see, especially when you look at across disadvantaged areas, which may be more separate from natural areas, to see whether people are more concerned if they're not taking action or if empowering people helps to combat eco-anxiety. And so I think it can also really be useful if we can have breakdowns like that when it comes to helping to protect kids' mental health as well, because it ties in so closely.
Great, thank you. And Andrew, from you, I mean, what can we use this survey, or how can we use the evidence from this survey? And I guess thinking about the Climate Education Action Plan and where this can help drive some of the activities there.
I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what's already been said. I guess I want to though perhaps emphasize the positive here. So I think for those of us, I mean, many people on the call who are listening as well have been involved in this area for some time. It feels quite hopeful at the moment to me that there is a government strategy on this. As Eleanor says, we may question some aspects of it, but there is a strategy, there is a way forward. And I think this baseline gives further evidence as to why that action is needed, why schools need to plan, why, picking up some of the points that Carl made, why we need to provide resources that schools can take off the shelf and incorporate some of this into the curriculum in the ways that Sylvia talked about. There are plenty of opportunities to do that. And having this baseline and measuring against that baseline is really critical to understanding what works. Ultimately, we're all interested in this because we want to know what works. And coming back to the point of it, of which we might be able to look at different areas where different approaches have been tried. This is something which is happening in other countries as well. So I don't know whether Pippa can comment on whether there are similar things planned in other countries where there have been quite large changes to curriculum in New Zealand, in Italy, and France, for example. And so understanding basic literacy there, how that literacy is changing over time, is just a guide for all of us to ultimately achieve the goal that we're aiming at, which is that young people leave school prepared for their future, basically. Great.
Pippa, do you want to come back on that? Have you any knowledge of more international studies and surveys?
I mean, I saw a comment in that what's quite difficult about this particular age group is if they were 16-year-olds, it'd be easier. Because it's 15, 16, we have to get consent from the parents to complete these surveys, which is why we can't just approach any children wherever they happen to be. So it does make a very tricky group, particularly in the UK, and rightly so. We can't be approaching minors about surveys, particularly on some of the topics that we sometimes looking to cover, which are often difficult and challenging. We haven't, as far as I'm aware, done a survey like this in other markets. We do a lot of work on international development where there may be some education elements in there, but not, it'd be fascinating to understand with knowledge of the different kind of importance that's put on climate education in different countries to look at those different markets. And there'll be similar process, but it's accessing and being able to conduct the research so that they, and no disrespect, but it's sometimes easy to go pop on your iPhone and look for the answer, right? But clearly running the survey in schools helps to provide that level of control, so that we truly get, are they aware? And yes, there'll be some overclaim of, yes, of some things inevitably in research. There'll be an element of that, but tracking is the important thing, that we're tracking that throughout time. So it's not an easy study to run, because there are children involved, and we need to go due process in order to ask these surveys to be completed. But it would be fascinating to understand the different dynamics in education that are being used across the globe, and awareness, because I'm sure we know that in the Southern Hemisphere, people are more concerned because it's impacting them greatly and their livelihoods. So therefore, awareness may also be higher because there's greater focus on it, whether that be through education or otherwise.
Great, thank you. I'm very conscious of time, and I did say I'd try and close this off by 20 past, so we are running out of time. Can I thank our panellists today, Andrew, Sylvia, Pippa, Eleanor and Carl. Really interesting to hear your thoughts. Thank you, Pippa, for presenting the highlights from the survey. Thank you to everybody who's been involved in a very active Q&A. I think we are recording this session, so it will be shared more widely. And I think what we'll try and do is capture the statements, comments, and try and answer some of the questions as best we can as well to distribute out. We probably won't get to everything, but we'll come back as much as we can, and really appreciate everybody's thoughts and contributions that we've tried to kind of gather over the last 50 minutes. It's certainly been a really interesting conversation. So I'm going to close off this webinar just by saying a big thank you to our panelists and to everybody who's contributed over the last 50 minutes or so. Thank you very much.